Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to continue our discussion about revisions. Yesterday I talked about the two tools that I like to use for revisions, and today I want to talk about scenes and how you can know which scenes you should cut, change, or add to your novel. So like I mentioned in my previous video, I like to use an outline for this process, but if you want to just use your novel itself and you want to work straight into your novel and you don't want to use an outline, that's totally fine. All of these tips will still work. So I'm just going to run through some tips and some things that you might want to look out for in your scenes so that you have a jumping off point for the editing process. It can make things a lot easier and a lot smoother. So tip number one is to look for scenes that are irrelevant. These are scenes that don't have an impact on the plot. The character doesn't learn any new information. The conflict is sort of irrelevant, or it doesn't show anything about the characters or the world. It doesn't really have any purpose in the story. You could pluck it out and nobody would have even known that it was there. Or maybe you couldn't fully pluck it out, but you could just write one or two sentences at the end of the previous or the beginning of the next scene, and that's all it would take to just completely eliminate the scene. This can be a great starting point. Some writers tend to have a lot of scenes that become irrelevant, or they aren't sure where they want to go with the story, so there can be sections of just sort of spinning your wheels and not really going anywhere, and the characters aren't really doing anything. And you can get a lot better perspective on your story if you just go ahead and cut those things out at the beginning of the editing process so you don't have to look at them and consider them. I know it can be painful to make cuts, but sometimes it's easier to just say goodbye to those scenes and see what you have left. Number two is to look for scenes that don't have any conflict. If there's no internal or external conflict, there's a good chance that the scene is kind of boring or isn't really pulling its weight. There are some situations where you might not have a conflict in the scene, but in general, those would be early on in the novel and not very frequent because you generally want to have that sense of progression that the story is moving forward. If you have a lot of scenes that don't have conflicts, it can really slow the story down and it can cause a really saggy middle in your novel. Now, you might have information in that scene that you need to move to another scene if you cut it, or you might find it easier to add a conflict to the scene so that you can pump it up and make it relevant, and so that you can keep it if it's important to the plot. Keep in mind that conflict is not just something bad happening. Conflict is when the character wants something, there's an obstacle in the way of what they want, and they have to fight against it. If the character doesn't want something and something bad happens that doesn't impact the goal, that's not a conflict in the structural sense. So make sure that what it happens, the bad things in the scenes, are actual true conflicts getting in the way of the character's goal and not just incidental negative things that happened. The conflict doesn't have to be external. It could be internal. For example, it doesn't have to be that the character wants an item and then someone won't give it to them. It could be something like the character doesn't want to embarrass himself and he ends up embarrassing himself. That can also work as a conflict, so it can be emotionally motivated. But if there's no conflict, there's no emotional conflict, there's no external conflict, the scene has a high chance of dragging or seeming boring, so I would recommend either adding a conflict or cutting the scene, especially if the scene takes place after the first quarter of the novel. So tip number three is to look for scenes that are redundant, scenes that are serving the same purpose. For example, if you have a character who hates school and you have a scene where you show them at school and they're having a bad day and it goes terribly, and then you have another scene that shows them at school having a bad day that goes terribly, unless those scenes are progressing the plot, there's new conflicts, the character's moving towards a goal or being pushed further away from their goal, there's no need for that other scene. And when you have a lot of scenes that are demonstrating the same thing, it can get boring, the reader can lose interest. So I recommend looking for those redundant scenes and cutting them out. Tip number four is to look for scenes that need to be added. Sometimes when writing the first draft, we accidentally or deliberately skip sections because we want to come back to it later, or because we forget to introduce a piece of information. And so it can be helpful to indicate what scenes you need to add so that you can make a plan to write those scenes. If you're using an outline, which I recommend, you can indicate where you want to add it in the outline. If you don't know exactly where you want to add the information, you can indicate a range in your revision plan or in your notes for editing. Maybe you say, need to explain about this spell and I need to do it between scene 27 and 29. That can just help you to get some sort of plan to remind yourself of what you want to accomplish. Tip number 5 is to look for scenes that have breadcrumbs of abandoned ideas. Sometimes we change our mind about what we want to write and we might start setting up something that never becomes relevant. This could be clues that are never followed up on, or characters that ultimately don't have any point or any purpose in the story. It could even be conflicts or objectives that the main character just abandons and never follows up with, or you decided that you don't want to include. Mark those scenes or cut those scenes so that you know, hey, there's something here that I don't want anymore and I need to take this out of the novel. A lot of the time when I work with clients, I can see those breadcrumbs of previous ideas that they're left in and they're not taken out. And it can just make the writing a little bit sloppy, or it can sometimes give the reader the wrong impression unless you're doing it purposefully as a red herring. It can sometimes give the reader the wrong impression about what the story is going to be about or what's going to happen. And in general, the space in the novel is pretty precious, and you probably don't want to sacrifice any space to some ideas or concepts or characters that just aren't necessary to the novel. So tip number 6 is to look for scenes that violate rules that are previously established. So maybe you indicated that technology works in a particular way in your world, and then you have a scene where it progresses the plot, but the way they use the technology to progress the plot violates those rules that you established, and you know that you're going to have to change it. Indicate that in your outline so that you can keep that in mind, so that you know that that's something you're going to have to work on. Sometimes these seemingly small changes, like writing out a mistake or writing out a place where you violated the rules, it can seem like it'll be an easy fix, I'll just deal with it later. But then when you get into it, sometimes it actually requires much bigger changes, like rewriting or altering 2 or 3 or 10 other scenes. So it can be really helpful to address those issues early on so that you know that you've fix that issue with the rule or you fix that violation, and you don't have to worry about rewriting and then discovering that you've messed up or it still doesn't make sense or it's not that simple of a solution, and then you have to start over or edit a whole bunch of scenes again. Of all of these things to look out for, probably the most important one is to look for the scenes that do not advance the plot, that don't provide any new information, that don't push the character towards their goal or farther away from their goal, that don't demonstrate something important about your character or their characterization or character arc, the scenes that just aren't going anywhere, because those are the scenes that can really, really drag down your story. It's not uncommon for writers to find that maybe 40, 50, even as much as 80% of the scenes in their novel fall into this category after the first draft. First drafts are notoriously sloppy, especially if you didn't plan ahead. You might find that you have a whole bunch of scenes that just do not progress the plot. When you get rid of those scenes, you can really see what you have left over. You can really examine it and determine what's worth preserving here. What do I have to work with? When I strip out all that's not working, what is working? And then how do I want to fill in the gaps there? So I really hope this video helped to give you a jumping off point for your edits so that maybe you have a little bit of a better idea of how you want to approach the editing process. If you have any questions about editing or you want any follow-up videos, just let me know in the comments. This is the second to last video for Novel Bootcamp. I will try not to disappear after Novel Bootcamp is over, but I will definitely not be posting at this frequency level. I really enjoyed making these videos for you guys, and I really hope that you found it helpful. Happy writing, guys. So I'm just going to run through a few tips for the editing process. Toby, quiet. Hey, Toby, I need you to be quiet. Shh, I need you to be quiet. No.